ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to kick this off this evening. As April said, my name is indeed Diane Danzebrink. This is my lovely friend and colleague, Jane. I'm going to ask Jane to sort of speak a little bit about her experience and how we know each other as we go along. So that's me. I am a menopause counsellor. I work specifically with women and couples, mainly women, more and more couples, and I'm delighted to say that I did my first Skype consultation with a worried husband the other day, which is definitely progress. So that's what I do. The other half of what I do is coming into organisations to raise awareness and educate. And generally what I do is I go in and I speak to staff members so that we're empowering women and hopefully men too. One of my lovely tutors is Kathy, who's sitting in the front row here. Who's been very helpful to me with understanding the medicine of menopause. So essentially what I do is I combine the psychotherapy with the medical, and then we give an overview which then allows people to go away and make some informed choices for themselves. What's been really interesting for me going into organisations is, particularly towards the end of any kind of talk that I give, is the queue that forms. More often than not it's women, but occasionally you do see men there too, who asking what they can do to help their wives. But it's the women at the end of the queue. It's the women who make sure that they hang back and they're last. And they're the ones that stand in front of you and make sure that nobody else can see them because they've got tears rolling down their faces. And they say things like, "I think you've just described me and I had no idea," or "I'm terrified of what this is doing to me and I'm really worried about my job and I don't know if I can keep going, but actually I think today you might have given me something that I can go away and think about." So it's interesting because obviously I'm only one person. My colleague Catherine has been doing this for an awful lot longer than I have, but you know, there are very few of us doing this work at the moment, but every time, I can guarantee you that every time there will be a handful of tearful women who have just made a connection. So very much menopause matters. If you are a woman, if you know a woman, if you employ a woman, if you love a woman, it matters. It makes a difference because it might affect women individually, but it will affect everybody that knows them, particularly if they're the 1 in 4 who has very serious debilitating symptoms. So the way that I got involved in all this was actually my own experience. In 2012, I had to have a total hysterectomy. So that involved, for me, the removal of my womb and both my ovaries. So that puts you into a surgical menopause. You go into menopause overnight. It's quite hard, and as I'm sure Kathy will tell you, quite hard and quite fast. And unfortunately for me, I didn't receive the right advice and support prior to my surgery. I didn't receive that before I left the hospital. I was simply told, go off and see your GP in about 6 weeks' time. I'd read a little bit about it because my mum had had the same surgery about 20 years earlier. I hadn't liked what I'd read about what my mum had been prescribed. And so thought, actually, I don't want that. But because nobody had updated me, that was all the information I had. And consequently, we don't have time for the whole story, and I'm sure you don't need to hear it, but consequently, the issue for me was very much more psychological than it was physical. I really had very little idea about the impact of such drastically diminishing estrogen levels and what that could do to my brain function and my moods, etc. And I'm very happy to tell you, because I've written about it and I've spoken about it a lot, but that took me to a very deep, dark place that I don't ever want to go to again. Now, fortunately, I am in the minority, but that is happening to people. And it's important that we recognise that, and that's one of the reasons for the campaign. As April said, the Make Menopause Matter campaign has come out of everything that I've learned and all the thousands of women that I've now spoken to. Jane was one of my clients. I'm pleased to say she's no longer one of my clients. She's now my friend. But she was one of my clients. And there are a lot of women suffering in a lot of different ways. And I have a very kind of simple mind. I see things very simply. And we need to do three things. We need to educate our healthcare professionals better. We need to have guidance in every workplace. Out of interest, does anybody have menopause guidance? 1, 2, 3, 4. Excellent. That's fantastic. So you all obviously have maternity policy. Not every woman will choose to have children or be able to have children. Every woman will have menopause. So, it makes sense just from that point of view. And I believe that we also need to include menopause in PSHE curriculum, age appropriately and taught appropriately, because at the moment, and we know that we've gone from 3 sentences on menstrual health in that curriculum to 6 this last week. And as the Secretary said when he was asked in Parliament, could we include menopause? And he said, no, we have to have a cut-off point somewhere. Well, do you know what? Actually, women's bodies don't think like that. They don't have a cut-off point. And actually, there is a lot more to us than, once we are no longer able to or want to have children. So we do need to find a place to include it. As I said, this is my lovely friend and now colleague, Jane Lewis. Jane has written this fabulous book. So if you thought menopause was taboo, we've got news for you. Jane, I'm going to ask you briefly to sort of say how we met, why we met, and how this fabulous piece of work came about.
Right, so basically, roughly 50% of all the women in this room are going to suffer with something they call it vaginal dryness, which is a polite word, vaginal atrophy. And believe me, it can be miserable. And I got to the point where I was virtually suicidal. My episiotomy scars were almost splitting open. I went to see Diane for a few sessions to get my mind in a good place. And then one day I said to her after a few sessions, I'm going to write a book on vaginal atrophy, because there are so many books out there, but none of them actually talk about this subject. It affects your sex life, your pelvic floor, and the shops are full of products selling goodness knows what for this itch and that burn, and adverts for my bothersome vagina, and it's because of this. And it is just so taboo, and the oops moments, we shouldn't be using pads. You can go to a women's health physiotherapist and get help. But it does affect people at work. It does stop women. I have a support group. There are women who have had to give up their jobs because they can no longer sit down, because they're burning, they're sore, they're itching. They need to go to the toilet all the time. They're getting up in the night to go to the toilet. And it is more for many women than hot flushes and anxiety. And although I say 50%, they actually think officially it's nearer potentially 70% or higher. We'll get this with an ageing population, so we're not designed to live 30-odd years without estrogen, and this is a big problem. If not for you now, it can become later on. Nursing homes are lots of ladies in a very bad way in nursing homes.
And that was the situation for you, Jane, wasn't it? That
yes.
you had to give up
yes,
your
I had
own.
to give up my job.
You were
yes.
working for yourself, and you had
yeah.
to give that up, didn't you, because
yes.
of what was going on with you?
Yeah.
So tonight it's not about scaring anybody. Tonight is very much about giving information and empowering people. So why does menopause matter? Well, all women will experience it. 1 in 4 will experience almost no symptoms at all. 1 in 4 will experience what we call debilitating symptoms, so severely affecting quality of life in some way, shape or form. Obviously, those symptoms can impact in a host of ways. Sometimes that's home life, personal relationships, sometimes that's with work. We currently have 4.3 million women over 50 in the workplace, and that's a huge 72% rise since 1994. So whilst this might not have been an issue that we had to tackle in the workplace perhaps 50 years ago, it certainly is something that we need to look at now, because we're going to have more women over 50 in the workplace. So it's not really about looking at what we haven't done in the past, it's about looking at, okay, so how can we take this forward and what can we do? As we heard earlier, you know, hopefully we're going to live well into our 80s, but we want those years to be good, productive, happy, healthy years. We don't want them to be years where we feel debilitated and we can't do things. So I don't know if anybody saw the recent BBC survey that was done. It was actually done in conjunction with BBC Sheffield, where 48% of women said that menopause had had a negative impact on their mental health. And I have to say that certainly with the women that I counsel personally, a lot of them, by the time they find me, are either on the verge of leaving work or they've actually already left. So to give you a sort of, for instance, in the past 6 months, I've counselled 4 NHS nurses and 3 teachers who have all left the profession. So the NHS that I'm looking at can't afford to lose nurses at that rate. None of those women wanted to leave work, but they had no support in the workplace, and they were finding it very difficult to access the right information via their GPs. So it's a bit of a storm. You know, it really is something that we need to look at seriously. Of those 48% of women, 41% that it said that they really felt that it affected their work. 25% said they wanted to stay at home. So if you relate that back to what I said earlier about the 25% who have debilitating symptoms, there's an interesting correlation there. And, you know, sort of in that survey, it said that apparently 1 in 4 women consider leaving the workplace. Not all do, but that's a huge amount of women who are considering leaving perhaps careers that they have built over a lifetime for something that actually can be really well managed with the right advice and support. So menopause support in the workplace. You know, what can we do? How do we start the conversation? Well, actually, this is a great forum for starting that, because hopefully a lot of you will go back into your workplaces. People will say to you, "What did you do yesterday evening?" And you will say, "Well, you'll never believe where I was." So this is a great start, but actually having information events actually within the workplace, and something that a police force, West Midlands Police Force have done, is they've actually produced some really fabulous information leaflets and stuck them on the back of the door of all the loos. And I mean all the loos, not just the ladies' loos, all of them. Now, it has resulted in a couple of police officers sitting on the loo crying because they've been sitting there looking up and they've suddenly realised, actually, I've got all those and I didn't realise what was going on with me. But it has really promoted the conversation, and West Midlands Police is a great example of what can be done. So, as I said, I quite often go into, as I know Catherine does, go into organisations and do awareness training and actually training for line managers. How do we have this conversation? This conversation. But what sort of things can you do? Really simple things. Can you offer some temporary flexible working? If you're an organisation that has a uniform, can you make some adjustments to that? If you have an office, you know, can there be some kind of change? Can the windows be opened? Can there be some kind of change in the temperature? Is it possible for somebody who perhaps is struggling with concentration, is it possible to give them a quieter space to work in, particularly if you're working in open plan offices? And one of the most successful things that I've been involved in, and this is both with supermarkets, with police forces, with fire services, is peer support. If you have somebody in the organisation who has struggled, very often they're very happy to be the lead on that peer support. And it's generally women talking to women, But what happens is once it gets going, you have women talking to men who, some of them have partners, some are saying, oh, you know that thing you're going to? Well, I read a bit of that information. I think my mum's going through that. And a bit more compassion and empathy generally just can't be a bad thing. That's the very leaflet that I was talking about. So as you can see, it's called Meno Lady, and it's made up of very many of the typical menopause symptoms. But it's been an incredibly powerful piece of work. It's very simple. It's such a simple idea. You know, a lot of the time when I speak to organisations, they're saying, well, you know, we have to fit this into well-being and there's only a certain amount of funding for that. And I think everybody understands that. But some of these things are so simple, actually could probably be produced in-house. So if anybody is thinking about some kind of menopause guidance and how you can get started, the Faculty of Occupational Medicine produced a really simple starter guide. So I think this is 4 pages. There are a couple of pages in there for employers, mainly aimed at HR and well-being, and there's a couple of pages in there which give some really simple ideas for women. It's downloadable, free, from any search engine. It's very, very simple way to start. So if you're thinking, actually, we need to look at this, this is a good place to start before anything else. I'm sure that you all have supportive pathways for mental health, for all sorts of health issues, etc., etc. The thing around creating a supportive pathway for menopause is we have to recognise that, as with everything else that we go through individually, not everybody wants to talk about it. So however much guidance you might have, it has to be for the individual to make that decision. But as with everything else, a supportive pathway is not something that a staff member should have to clear branches and trees to find. It should be something that's set out very simply because you've raised awareness. Because I don't know, you might or might not concur, we haven't had this conversation, but I know that certainly for me, at my very worst, I mean, I was working for myself, but there was no way I would have been able to go and find any kind of supportive pathway. If it wasn't laid out in front of me, if I wasn't aware that it was there, I mean, I could barely get out of bed, so...
And I could definitely have not said to someone, I can't sit down because my vagina's hurting, or my vulva. It just wouldn't have been a conversation opener. But since I have opened that conversation, literally, I now get emails from around the world. And I've had an email this week from a intensive care nurse from Scotland who's had to give up her job because of her vaginal problems from menopause.
So... If you start to put this out and you have women within the organisation who say, actually, I've really struggled, but I'd like to help with that, then you can create menopause champions, as you would with mental health champions. Make those people known, and then what happens is women and men within the organisation can seek those people out, and that can be the first step in your supportive pathway. Oh, the clicker's stopped working. Aha. Did anybody hear any of the Women's Hour series in January last year that was on the back of the... Yeah, okay. So a few nods. So in January last year, there was a series of 5 programmes over a week, all about menopause, different aspects of menopause. And they're all, you can actually still hear all of them on BBC, I think it's BBC Sounds these days, they've just changed it. But we had a really interesting conversation. And what we learned through that conversation is that employers are losing good, valuable members of staff. That's costing women, that's costing employers, and actually to some extent, it's costing us as a nation. And for me, that's my quote up there, which I finished my speech with on BBC Woman's Hour, having awareness, and I should have said support at the time, within the workplace is a win-win situation. Ladies and gentlemen, it has been our pleasure. Yes? Thank you.